Good afternoon. It's great to be here, and just congratulations to the team at ExcelinEd for a tremendous conference. So, absolutely, it's my honor to be here and to meet the Right Honorable Nick Gibbs. I think I got that right, and just to have a little discussion today. I want to cover a few things. I want to hear about your background first, and then maybe we'll talk a little bit about literacy, and then a little bit about math and the assessments, and then hopefully we'll have enough time to get some of your reflections at the end. So, first off, tell us a little bit about your journey. I know you spent over a quarter of a century in the House of Commons, and then becoming Minister of State for Education. But where did it start? Where did you grow up in the UK, and how did you get to education?
Well, I was elected in 1997. It's like 100 years ago, and before that I was with KPMG as a chartered accountant, and I really got involved and interested in politics in my teens when Margaret Thatcher was Prime Minister, leader of the opposition, and then Prime Minister. And I came into politics because of ideas, and I loved what Mrs. Thatcher was saying about the free market and monetarist policy and so on, and I liked her relationship with Ronald Reagan. I'm a great Reaganite. In fact, I don't have a Reagan-Bush T-shirt, but I'm going to buy one online. But I do have a Bush-Cheney poster from the Philadelphia Convention. I have many of them on my walls in my office. But I was inspired by ideas, and it's ideas that drove me into politics. I was elected in 1997, and then we were in opposition then for 13 years, which is very frustrating.
And then how did you get from going from being an accountant to then being sort of challenged, I assume, by the situation with schools in the UK? Talk to us a little bit about that, and about what kind of condition the schools were in once you assumed the role of being a member of Parliament.
Well, before I was elected, I stood in a by-election, and I remember meeting the head teacher of a local school who told me that they had removed all the knowledge-rich books from the library, and which I was astonished by, frankly. And then when I was elected as a member of Parliament in 1997, I started visiting schools in my district, and I was told that the reading age of children starting high school at 12, that 50% of the children in that school started school with a reading age below their chronological age, and a quarter had a reading age 2 years or more below their chronological age. And I really couldn't understand this. My mother was a primary school teacher. All her children read fluently. And so I asked around the primary schools what was happening. How often did you hear children read? And they said, once a week. Well, you should be hearing children read every day. And then I got into the whole phonics debate and learnt about the ideological differences between the kind of whole language approach to teaching reading and the systematic synthetic phonics teaching reading. Then the other thing I was worried about was our position in PISA. So, people ask, what has the OECD ever done for us? Well, it's produced the PISA results. And what it showed in England was that we were going from 7th in the year 2000 in reading to 17th in 2006 to 25th by 2009. And similarly in maths, we went from 8th in 2000 to 24th, and then to 28th in the world by 2009. So I really wanted to understand, why was the British, particularly the English education system, declining internationally? And I set out really to find out what was the cause of that.
And I've heard some of your other sort of sessions in which you spoke, and you talked about the importance of visiting the schools. And I think it was Mondays, maybe, when you were a minister, that you made it your business to make it around I assume around the country, to go and actually into the schools. That must have been quite a stir in the schools if you showed up. I mean, how did that go?
Well, I got myself invited, but in opposition, between 2005 and 2010, I was what we call the shadow minister for schools, like a minority, not the minority leader, but the minority spokesman on schools. So every Monday I visited schools up and down the country, and I think with those 5 years in opposition and my 10 years as minister, I think I've visited over 1,000 schools. So well done, Governor Bush, for 250, but 1,000, just saying. And I learnt a lot from those visits. And what I learned, because I was quite impertinent really in the questions I was asking, as well as inviting myself, I was also quite impertinent in asking children their general knowledge, asking them their multiplication tables, asking them what they read. And I learned from those years in opposition that there was an ideology in education. I had a feeling anyway from my own school career from 1965 to 78, during which there had been sweeping changes to our education system in Britain, introduced by the Anthony Crossland and the Harold Wilson government, that brought in what I would call a progressivist ideology of mixed ability teaching, low expectations, poor behavior in schools. And I saw that when I was visiting schools. And I came to the conclusion that it was progressivist educational ideology that was the cause of our decline in the International League tables. And that the only way we as a government, coming into government in 2010, were going to tackle that wasn't just piecemeal policies, it was to change the whole zeitgeist, to change the whole ideological approach to the education system in England. And that's what we set out to do. But what I couldn't do during those 5 years was define properly what I meant by progressivist education. I think I knew what I meant, but I couldn't define it more than things like phonics and mixed ability teaching, that mixed ability teaching was part of the progressive ideology. I couldn't go beyond that until I discovered an American academic who helped me.
Well, talk a little bit about that, because I think the American academic may be in a state that I'm from, and at a school in a town called Charlottesville, which obviously he's been world renowned in his cutting edge sort of thinking, not without controversy. Talk a little bit about what sparked your interest in what E.D. Hirsch was doing at the University of Virginia.
Well, as I said, I was struggling with the definition of progressivism. And so my researcher said I should read this book by E.D. Hirsch called The Schools We Need and Why We Don't Have Them. So I took it on holiday in 2006 to South Carolina, to Hilton Head, lay on the beach, and forced myself to read it. And it was transformational. It was the Rosetta Stone that explained to me what progressivism was. It's all about America, but everything applied to England. And basically, what he said was that knowledge is really important, that knowledge builds on knowledge. And for children who come from a disadvantaged family, who don't have knowledge at home, and they come to a school where knowledge is not regarded as important, the kids from the more affluent families, where knowledge builds on knowledge, can gain something from their education, and the gap widens between the two things. And he calls it the Matthew effect. From those that have, more shall come, and from those that don't have, what they have will be taken away. And he's essentially said that the same applies to education. For those children that have knowledge, they come to school, that's a Velcro that you can then build upon and gain more knowledge, and that gap widens. And I was very influenced by that, and I realized that we in England had adopted what's called a competence-based curriculum in 2007. But that was essentially, even before 2007, it was how the curriculum was constructed in most schools. That what they said was knowledge doesn't matter, that you can look things up in Google, that these children will have jobs that don't yet exist, so that today's knowledge is irrelevant. And Hirsch explodes that myth. And he essentially says that if you want those higher order skills that the progressivists say you should have, and I think you should have, and I agree too, critical thinking, problem solving, creativity, these are all hugely important skills in a modern economy like the United States and England. But what Hirsch says is, you don't get those skills by just teaching those skills directly. You get those skills from deep knowledge of mathematics, if you want to be a problem solver, from deep knowledge of the humanities and the arts, if you want to be creative, from deep knowledge of science, if you want to be a critical thinker. And so he says, paradoxically, that for an American education system that was driving the teaching of those skills, you don't get those skills. You actually get them if you have a proper curriculum that's built on knowledge. And I was very influenced by that. And so when we came into office in 2010, we set about reviewing the curriculum and bringing in a knowledge-rich curriculum in England.
So before I ask you the question of the sort of acceptance and the fights that I'm sure were ahead for you once you started on this agenda, talk a little bit about evidence-based literacy instruction and the research behind it, how that sort of melds into the knowledge-rich curriculum that you just spoke about in E.D. Hirsch.
So, as I said, in opposition 05 to 10, struggling with definition of what progressivism meant. But in 2003, I met this lady called Ruth Miskin. And she was a teacher who had been taught to teach reading in the kind of progressivist way, whole language. And she came to the view it wasn't working for her kids. And she developed a systematic synthetic phonics approach to reading. And it was phenomenally successful in an East London school serving the most deprived part of the most deprived community. I met her, and she explained to me this debate, this ideological debate, between whole language teaching or multi-cueing, to listen to the wonderful Emily Hanford podcasts, which everybody should listen to, Sold a Story.
Well, I think she spoke here at our national summit 2 years ago.
So everyone's, I mean, she's superb. I met her in Washington a few weeks ago. But so in 2003, I met Ruth Miskin, and she explained to me this debate. She also introduced me to a piece of research called the Clackmannanshire Study, a small local authority in Scotland, where they took 300 pupils and divided them up into 3 groups of 100. The first group was taught a systematic synthetic phonics way of teaching reading, and the other 2 groups were taught a kind of mixed method, similar to what we had in England, a multi-cueing method, what's called the searchlights model in England. After 16 weeks, the phonics group was 7 months ahead of their chronological age in reading and 7 months ahead of the other 2 groups. So morally, they had to put all 300 children on the synthetic phonics groups. So the researchers from Hull and St Andrews University followed these children for 7 years. And at the end of elementary school in Scotland, these 300 children, on average, had a word reading age 3.5 years ahead of their chronological age, and 1 year, 9 months ahead of their chronological age in spelling. So we use this evidence to just absolutely say we have got to have a synthetic phonics approach to the teaching of reading. And when I visited primary schools in those years in opposition, phonics really wasn't spoken about in schools. So we changed the law requiring teachers to use synthetic phonics in teaching reading. We changed the teacher's standards, so to qualify as a primary school teacher, you had to be able to teach reading using systematic synthetic phonics. And we changed the inspection regime, and we introduced a phonics screening check. And I don't know whether there are any slides available, but if there are, probably technology never seems to work. We introduced a phonics screening check. And this was very controversial because it was a test for 6-year-olds. So people said, you cannot test 6-year-olds. And it was 40 words, 40 simple words, that 6-year-olds had to read one-to-one to their teacher. And half of the words were made-up words, like biff, mig, totally made-up words. Even in America, they're made-up words. And
touche, yeah.
And when we piloted it, the pass mark was 32 correctly read words out of 40. When we piloted it, only 33% reached that standard. When it was introduced and when it became compulsory in all schools in 2012, 58% passed, which means 42% did not. After 2 years at school, they were still struggling to read simple words. Over the years, we promoted synthetic phonics. We gave schools training materials and physical materials. Every year it went up and up and up. And just before COVID, it had reached 82%. Wow. And as a consequence of that, if you go to a primary school in England now, everyone will be doing phonics, systematic synthetic phonics in the primary school. And now England, I say England, not Britain, England is now 4th in the world in our reading of 9-year-olds.
Wow. That's amazing. So I want to pick up on that point about England versus UK, and then also it is really synthetic phonics, synthetic, is that what synthetic phonics, and the knowledge-based curriculum, 2 real sort of prominent pillars in your your quest to try and make sure that all kids could get the maximum amount of their school experience? Is that?
They were so we...
in the literacy area.
So one person I've not mentioned is the Secretary of State for Education at that time, Michael Gove. So, he was the real driver of our reform program. It's a privilege to work for him as Secretary of State. But the things I've been talking about are what I call the standards agenda, and that's what I was really driving. The other part of the agenda is the structural agenda. So we were worried that, because our schools are all run by the local authorities. We have 150 local authorities in England. And in those local authorities, the officials were really part of the progressivist agenda. They were promoting that ideology in all the schools. Not deliberately, it was just the way things were. There was no other challenge to it. So we wanted to make sure that schools were taken away from the local authorities, and we wanted to give schools and professionals the autonomy so that they were able to introduce evidence-based approaches to education. They wouldn't be kind of crushed by the sort of prevailing orthodoxies that emanated from the local authorities. So we basically took the policy of the previous Labour government called academies. And academies are essentially charter schools. And we promoted academies, charter schools, and we allowed schools to opt to become independent, but funded directly from the Department for Education through a funding agreement. When we came into office in 2010, there were 200 academies. Now, 80% of all high schools are academies, and 45% of all primary schools are academies. Why does this matter? It's just a structural thing. It matters because we have liberated the teaching profession. And now if you come to our country, this is probably the thing I'm most proud of in our education reforms. Jim Callaghan, who was Prime Minister in Labour in 1976, made a very important seminal speech called the Ruskin College speech. And he was criticised, even before he made the speech, that he was even making a speech about education, that he was entering the secret garden, where only educational academics from the universities were allowed to go. And he said, we had to do something about these new informal methods of teaching and so on. But he was criticised even for making it. And what we've done now in England is we have taken away the fences and the gates to the secret garden, and teachers are occupying that garden. They are blogging, they are writing, they are attending conferences like the Research Ed conferences that was founded by Tom Bennett in 2014, I think. And so the teachers themselves now have got control of this agenda about pedagogy and curriculum. And I was in Antwerp day before yesterday, and there was a presentation by a lady called Alex Pethick from the Knowledge Schools Trust. This is an academy that decided they wanted a knowledge-rich curriculum for primary schools, and they created one, really high quality, and they're selling it and promoting it in hundreds of other primary schools in England. Those movements would never have happened had we not also liberated schools from the control of the local authorities.
So was it, you keep saying England, so what about Wales? What about Scotland? What about Northern Ireland? Was the uptake the same, or just different sort of entrenched establishments you had to take on? How did all that happen?
Well, look, we were criticized. The things I've been describing, they're hugely controversial. And one of the things we had behind us was the Prime Minister, David Cameron. If it hadn't been for David Cameron, we couldn't have done this. No. We had to have his backing. He is an intelligent politician. He understood the debate and wanted us to do it, really pushed us to do it. But it was controversial. And some of the criticism, some of the fiercest criticism, came from the devolved administrations from Scotland and Wales. Because education, although I was a UK government minister, we only controlled education in England. Education was devolved to the administration. So Scotland had their own education policies, so did Wales. They did not agree with our approach to any of this. Not the phonics, not the knowledge-rich curriculum, not the academies program, not publishing the results of tests school by school. They got rid of all that accountability. And guess what? They are declining in PISA. We did have a slide that showed them going down since really down to like 30th in maths and science, both in Wales and in Scotland, whereas we have been going up in PISA since 2016. We're now 11th in PISA in maths, whereas we were 28th. On the other hand, Scotland and Wales are both going down, and they're now about 30th in the world in maths and science. So what we have in the United Kingdom is Sadly, because I want the best for children in Scotland and Wales as well, but sadly we have a natural randomized controlled trial. And what that randomized controlled trial is showing is that progressivist education, as was always my instinct, does not work, because they introduced in Wales and Scotland an even more progressive competence-based curriculum. In Scotland it's called the Curriculum for Excellence. And what it is, the Curriculum for Excellence is very high level, confident individuals that can participate in society. And it's all about the skills that they want from those children. We all want those skills. But that's not what the curriculum is for. The curriculum is to specify what needs to be taught in each subject. And they don't do that. And so what's happened in Scotland and Wales is that they are floundering. And now they're declining in those international league tables.
So if we can turn to math for a minute and tell us a little bit about sort of where did you look in terms of trying to reform mathematics curriculum, education in general, and the challenges that came with that versus the literacy area.
So we were worried about, I said, the PISA results up until 2009. We were declining. So we looked at the top of PISA, which you would, wouldn't you? And we looked at Singapore, South Korea, Shanghai, and China. And I went out to Shanghai, went to Hong Kong, and had a look at what they're doing in those countries. And we essentially I took the 2007 Singapore curriculum, photocopied it, and stuck it in our national curriculum. We then had to consult, democracy for you. And the consultation resulted in it being weakened slightly, but nevertheless, it's still great. And in fact, one of the things that happened in the consultation, it's a lesson for policymakers, is it went out to the maths education community in draft. And in the notes and guidance next to everything, it said practice, practice, practice. It came back in tracked changes with the word practice excised all the way through it. I was furious. And because you need to practice these things. It's no good just being taught it once. You need to practice to get the fluency and effortless so you can just do it automatically. The automaticity that Daniel Willingham, another one of your constituents, talks about, that you need that automaticity because your short-term memory it isn't big enough for too much new information. It needs to be in the long-term memory. So we took that sort of East Asian approach to mathematics. We also had some exchanges with Shanghai, although they've stopped recently because of COVID. And the approach of East Asia is essentially to take each step by step, slowly, 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 teaching the algorithm. So there'll be a whole lesson. I saw this lesson in an exemplar lesson when the teachers came to England, how to multiply 2 digits ending in a 0. So 30 times 70. So she said, 30 times 70. Step 1, throw away the zeros. What are you left with? 3 times 7. What are 3 sevens? 21. How many zeros did you throw away? 2. So pick up the zeros. How many zeros are you going to pick up? 2. 21, 0, 0. The answer is 2100. So there's that kind of step by, and I looked at the children in that lesson. Every single child was following what to do. And that's the approach they take. And through that, step by step, then practice, and an explanation of what they're learning. They get fluency, but B, they get a deep understanding of the mathematics they're being taught. So we introduced that in England. We changed the tests. So they became compulsory in 2014. We changed the tests at the end of primary school. They're much tougher to reflect the new higher standards. Of course, the results plummeted in the first year, but then they went up and up every year after that as schools got used to it. I was also worried that children didn't know their tables. When I did my impertinent visits to schools, I would ask Year 6 children their tables. And, some hands went up, but not all the hands went up. And when you got to 1111s, which you all know are 121, there was almost no hands went up. So we introduced another test, a computer-based test for 9-year-olds, Year 4. So they have 6 seconds to answer 25 questions, 6 seconds each, of multiplication tables. We took years to implement it. One of the advantages of being in office for so long is that you can see these policies through. But I also had my Rosemary issues when the Pearls results were about to come out. So the Rosary issues when the Pearls came out. But so when it became finally compulsory in 2022, 27% of children got 100%, and the average score was 20-point-something correct answers. And that's now our baseline for the future. And if you go to a primary school now in England and ask those questions I asked, you'll see every hand going up. They all know their tables.
And is the fight still ongoing? And what is the current sort of government now thinking about these advancements that you've accomplished in England, at least? And are they continuing, or is it now the fight reemerging to return back to some other progressive idea?
Well, the teacher unions in England were never in favor of our policy changes.
Even after all the evidence of success?
Even after all this success. And I think, I mean, I always made sure I had good relationships with the teacher unions. So we would discuss and debate in the same way that Governor Bush was saying earlier, that they respected my sincerity and things I wanted to achieve, closing the attainment gap between disadvantaged children and their peers. But they never agreed with any of the policies, even if they were polite to me face to face. They would criticize them publicly. And so there's a bit of the new Labour administration that's come in that sort of leans into that criticism. The thing is, though, they're not going to change the phonics check. The new Secretary of State has already confirmed that that's staying in place. And why wouldn't you? I mean, it's working. I mean, We're now 4th in the world. Why would you jeopardize that? And she accepts that. In fact, she thinks that they invented phonics. So
let them think.
Exactly. Who cares? That's fine. Fine by me. They are reviewing the curriculum, which makes me anxious.
This is the knowledge base.
Yes, the national curriculum. But there are some good people on their expert panel, so I'm moderately confident that it won't be too bad. There'll be some things they do that will be annoying, but I think overall it'll be okay. But why I'm really optimistic, though, is, as I said, we liberated the teaching profession. And I started in 2012 a sort of movement called the Knowledge Network of teachers that really did agree with the agenda. That has spread. And now, I said, people are going to these teacher conferences. There are lots of schools and academies in the country now that are producing knowledge-rich curricula. It will be very difficult for any government to put that genie back in the bottle because, teachers love it because it works. Children love knowing things. And from knowing things, they are developing cognitively. Their vocabulary is... If you talk to Robert Pondisio, the AAI, he'll tell you that if you want reading comprehension, you need the phonics, yes, to get the mechanics of reading. But if you want good, fluent readers who can comprehend what they're reading, they need knowledge, because knowledge is vocabulary, and you need vocabulary to be able to comprehend what you're reading. So I think teachers understand that now in England.
And is your system, too, was it by dictate from Westminster to the school districts and localities, or was there a carrot stick kind of... How does that work in England?
Well, one thing you realise when you become a minister, you go into the department, you go up to the 7th floor, and you have all these levers, and then you start moving them, and you realise they're made of rubber. And so you have to be clever, the things you do. You have to I always say, get your documentation right. You really have to get the documentation right. So the national curriculum had to be right. And, we talk about in the weeds. Absolutely in the weeds. I was totally in the weeds. And there wasn't a single document that I wasn't all over and redrafting. First of all, the drafting was terrible, but also some of the policy had to be right. And those documents determine everything. So you get that right. But that's a necessary condition, not a sufficient condition. You then have to enhance the minds. And that is about speeches. It's about building this movement, if you like, teacher movement and it's about liberated teachers. So it's a whole combination. And it's not just one lever, it's the teacher stand, it's the inspection framework, it's the accountability system. What results do you put in league tables, performance tables? We couldn't, for example, I couldn't publish the phonics results on a school-by-school basis in the way that we had for the end of primary school results, because I just couldn't get that through the unions. I knew I wouldn't. Nevertheless, those results are looked at by the inspectorate when they're judging a school. So they do. So there are lots of methods, but you have to win hearts and minds. It's not simply sitting in the department, with a pen.
Well, I remember, Governor, with your brother, when I first got to Congress, and it was No Child Left Behind, and there were all these debates in Washington about how do we get the uptake, and was it going to be, again, carrot, stick, how do you bring folks along? So what you're saying, it is sort of all of the above. You've got to... Yes,
and the stick is the accountability.
Yeah.
We have a very strong accountability system in England, which we inherited. It was really delivered in 1988 and 1992. 88 brought in the first national curriculum. And it also changed the funding of schools so that funding depended on the number of pupils. And parents in England have free choice. You can send your child to any school. But of course, the popular schools are oversubscribed, and they have oversubscription criteria of who gets in and who doesn't. But in theory, you can go to any school. We brought in Ofsted, the inspectorate was created in 1988. And in 1992, we legislated to publish the results of both the GCSE exams with the proportion achieving certain grades in those age 16 qualifications, and the results of the reading, writing, and maths tests at the end of primary school. We published the proportions that reach the expected standard in every school. And I can look on my phone and tell you the results of every school. And that really matters. It really does push up standards, that accountability. Teachers, the teacher unions absolutely loathe it. Right. They really do. But even though it was introduced at the end of the Conservative government that left in 1997, the government under Tony Blair continued with that. He didn't throw that out. Right. And that continuity, is really important.
So, yeah, built up some of the support.
Yeah.
So, we talked a little bit this morning about the assessments and what's going on in this country with ballot initiatives and testing requirements. And one of the wealthiest states, we mentioned Massachusetts, just last week, 2 weeks ago, passed an initiative to do away with graduation testing. I mean, here you have a state, I don't know if we've got Massachusetts here, but with probably the wealthiest per capita, and probably right up there in one of the most educated. And yet, the voters said, we don't need any more testing in order to be certified to graduate. First of all, that just strikes me as just so counterintuitive. How in the world? But talk a little bit about where that is in England right now, in the UK in general. You mentioned that in the other jurisdictions, Scotland, Wales, et cetera, there's totally different. But in England, still testing, rigorous?
Yes, absolutely. It was also in Wales, but they got rid of it. This is the problem. And I think if there was a ballot in England, there is a sort of movement, a sort of Mumsnet sort of movement of mothers and parents who worry about their 11 and 10-year-old being tested. And so every time that the results come out and go on the radio or the television, I would be criticised for, what are you testing these children for? So I'm not convinced we'd win a ballot in England if there were one. But it really is important. And I say to people who criticise the fact, so we have tests now. The essential tests are the phonics screening check at age 6. And then we have then the major, what we call the SATs, the final year of primary school in reading, writing, maths, grammar, punctuation, and spelling as well. But we really focus in the publication, the league tables on the reading, writing, and maths. So those figures, so it really matters. It just drives standards. But I say to parents who are critical of the fact that their 10-year-old, 11-year-olds are being tested, look, this is not a high-stakes test for the children. It really isn't. This isn't a qualification. What it does do is it holds the schools to account. And your child is benefiting from the fact that in years gone by, previous 10-year-olds and 11-year-olds have taken this test to make sure that we know which schools in the country are underperforming. And we'd like your child to do the test for the same for the future 10, 11-year-olds coming through. And it really does matter. It means that we can identify those schools that are just not getting the results they ought to be getting and take action.
How does it work in England and the UK in general with when you get in the equivalent of high school and testing at that level in order to graduate, and then the response, if you will, from the universities as to the preparedness of students coming out of the secondary education system?
So it's a good question. So we have two sets of public exams at high school. One at the age 16, it's called the General Certificate of Secondary Education, the GCSE. There's one in each subject. And we publish the proportion that reached the expected standard of every school. So you can look at a school's results and say, well, this school is getting really bad results. I'm not sending my child there. Then at 18, which is 16 to 18 is not compulsory, but at 18, about half the children stay on to do academic sixth form. And then we have A-levels, advanced levels. And children generally do about 3 or 4 of those. And they are the entry qualification to university. So when we were in opposition, the universities were complaining that the undergraduates starting university were not as well prepared as previous generations. And that's one thing we reformed. We reformed the subject content of A-levels and GCSEs to make them more rigorous, to up the expectations. And one of the things that policymakers might be interested in is that we had, until we came into office in 2010, almost subcontracted that operation, the national curriculum, the content of GCSEs and A-levels, to an arm's length body called the Qualifications and Curriculum Authority that I felt was unaccountable. Because there is this view in the education world that politicians, who am I, chartered accountant, why am I deciding these things, shouldn't have any of their dirty fingers in the content of the curriculum. Leave that to the expert teachers. And so leave it to an expert body like the QCA. But it was the QCA that in 2007 introduced the competence-based curriculum based on no evidence that it works. And all the evidence we've got from not just Hirsch and Willinger, but countless other research evidence, it's not the way to get the best out of our young people and prepare the future economy. So essentially, we abolished the QCA in 2010, and we took in-house the content. We signed off the content. David Cameron made an important speech in opposition about this. He said that that policy matters and administration should be dealt with by ministers accountable to Parliament. Don't forget, we take our ministers from the House of Commons. I'm a member of Parliament. You have to be in a parliamentary system. And the only regulatory matters that cannot be part of the political system should be out with the department. So we regulate the standards of exams. That's done by a regulator. But the content of the curriculum, we sign off. And we up the ante about that. We take expert advice, of course, you consult, but the final responsibility has to be the minister who's accountable.
Did you get pushback from the teachers or parents about teaching to the test and what happens with critical thinking and all that? Because I know that was somewhat of a noise in this country when we started talking about testing, at least in Virginia. That was at a time that was a big issue.
Yes, and they do that. The same arguments happen in England. And you've got to devise the test so it doesn't matter if they're teaching to the test. But I always say to people, to our education system in England, don't teach to the test. Actually, terrible practice in some of the weaker schools in year 6, where all they do is practice papers. Just a complete waste of time. You do not improve your reading skill by doing lots and lots of practice papers. You don't. You're just measuring. If you want children to do well in the reading test at the end of primary school, get those children reading lots of books. Make sure they're read to every day. We did a survey of one particular local authority. I asked them to go away and tell me how many primary schools do they read to their children every day. And I was told that half of the schools in that area only read to their children once a week. They need to be read to every day to improve their vocabulary and their understanding of stories and so on. But just practicing and teaching to the test is not the way to do well in those tests. We keep making that point.
Interesting. So talk a little bit. You got policymakers in the room, and they deal with changes in administrations. Our system much different than parliamentary. So expected when you have elected of a new chief executive, a governor in a state, there's going to be new leaders, new ideas. What was your experience you talked about being a minority and then David Cameron's real role in this, and then you had more conservative leaders after Cameron, after Brexit. How do you navigate all that and stay on course with what you were trying to do?
It is difficult, and I said, if it hadn't been for David Cameron as Prime Minister, we could not have introduced the vast reform that we introduced. For me, it was a white-knuckle ride. We were just doing so much in a short space of time, and it was controversial. Everything was controversial, and unless you have the backing of the Prime Minister, you can't withstand the barrage of criticism. But as it settled, and as it was clear that it was working, as it increasingly was, that gave us sort of more authority to do more. So after David Cameron, he resigned in 2016 after the Brexit referendum. We then had Theresa May, who again was very supportive, and her advisor, Nick Timothy, again was absolutely understood what we were doing and supported us. And then we had Boris, who I remember Boris, he was on our education shadow team for one stage, and every time I would bump into him in the corridor, he'd go, "Oh, phonics, oh, phonics." But I'm not sure, I'm not convinced that his understanding went much beyond that. He's a great character, and he won us the 2019 election with a great thumping majority. But I said, by that stage, Michael Gove, he was no longer Secretary of State, he'd moved on, but I was still there, and the authority came with having been there for so long, but also the fact that things were beginning to work. And then Liz Truss was a disaster, 45-day Prime Minister. And then we're moving to Rishi Sunak, who believed strongly in education.
Right. And now you say some of the changes may be underway, but I think the longevity that you have experienced and the success may hopefully allow this in England to stay on course.
I think so. What people underestimate, and policymakers, I'm so sure, will underestimate this, but if you have an education system like ours in England, where the importance of knowledge had been downplayed. You know, this by-election when I met this head teacher was 1994. So even in 1994, 13 years before they introduced officially the competence-based curriculum, the schools were still saying knowledge is Gradgrindian, it's boring, this is not what you need in the modern world, what you need are these skills. That was very, very concreted into our education system. So if suddenly you introduce a knowledge-rich curriculum, where you've got to teach a lot of detail, historical detail and geographical detail and scientific detail. Of course, there is knowledge. Some of these debates, sometimes they get polarized and oversimplified. Of course, there's knowledge in the teaching of science. You will have seen this in 1994, science teaching that is a lot of knowledge. But the objective of the lesson was scientific method. The objective of the history lesson was how to act like a historian, understand sources and evidence and all that kind of stuff. The knowledge was there, but it was incidental. And as a consequence, the knowledge was slightly superficial. And in history, you would repeat the same periods over and over again often, as you were teaching different historical skills. So, so trying to undo all that and replace it with a knowledge-rich curriculum is phenomenally difficult with teachers that are themselves probably being taught without the knowledge. And that's why this teacher movement is so important, because now there are lots of schools, not just the one I mentioned, but others up and down England, that are themselves creating really high quality knowledge organizers, their own sort of textbooks, or it's amateurishly produced, but they're still very high quality content. And so it is not an easy task changing the whole way a teaching profession teaches. And that's why you need that movement, and think tanks like this, are really important in order to help, the education system develop this kind of curriculum.
So if you look to the future, as we're closing up here, if it look to the future, would you say is that the biggest issue facing education writ large, is to try and sort of continue to infuse and win hearts and minds throughout the ecosystem, including how we teach teachers? What would you say the number one challenge is going forward for the next 5 years?
Well, this movement is going global. So Erica Stanford, the Education Secretary in New Zealand, is introducing a knowledge-rich curriculum. She's phenomenal. They're in Australia, South Australia has implemented our own phonics check. We gave it to them. And New Zealand are taking it from South Australia and using it in New Zealand. So this movement is happening all over the world. It's happening here as well. The debates are happening about knowledge-rich curriculum in this country. And it's happening in Sweden, it's happening, I was in Belgium day before yesterday, where they're talking about knowledge-rich curricula. So I think this movement of evidence-led, I didn't mention the fact we set up a What Works Foundation in 2010 with £137 million to spend on randomized controlled trials, testing what works. So I think it is about spreading the importance of knowledge in the curricula of all our schools and winning that battle of ideas, absolutely crucial. And think tanks play a massive role in helping to promote that message.
Well, phenomenal career and accomplishment. Thank you for being such a warrior and continuing the fight. So please join me in thanking the Right Honorable Nick Gibbs.
Thank you.